In the harsh winter of 1883, in the unforgiving mining town of Silver Creek, Montana, a father's addiction would shatter one family and forge the destiny of two souls who never expected to find each other. What began as the darkest day in a young woman's life would become the first chapter of a love story that would change an entire community forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver-framed daguerreotype of Margaret Hayes sat cracked on the mantelpiece, its glass spiderwebbed from the night Robert Hayes had thrown a whiskey bottle in a drunken rage. The woman in the portrait seemed to watch over the cabin with sad, knowing eyes, the same eyes her daughter Elena had inherited, along with her mother's determined chin and gentle spirit. Elena Hayes knelt beside the fireplace, carefully sweeping up the glass shards that had fallen the night before. At 19, she moved with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned to make herself invisible during her father's increasingly frequent episodes. The mining accident that had claimed her mother 2 years ago had taken more than Margaret. Hayes' life. It had stolen away the man Robert Hayes used to be. The Hayes family had once been among Silver Creek's most respected residents. Robert had worked as the mine foreman, a position that came with a comfortable salary and a house on Prosperity Hill, overlooking the bustling mining operations below. Margaret had been the town's seamstress, known for her intricate embroidery and kind heart. Their home had been filled with laughter, the smell of fresh-baked bread, and the sound of Margaret's voice singing while she worked. Those days felt like someone else's memories now. The mine collapse that killed Margaret and 7 other workers had happened during a particularly harsh February storm. The support beams, weakened by years of Montana winters and poor maintenance, had given way without warning. Robert had been the one to find his wife's body crushed beneath the rubble of what should have been her safe workplace. The mine owners had offered their condolences and a modest settlement, enough to bury the dead, but not enough to heal the living. Elena remembered the exact moment she realized her father was disappearing. It was 3 weeks after the funeral, when she found him sitting at the kitchen table at dawn, still wearing yesterday's clothes, a bottle of whiskey open beside him, and tears streaming down his face. He hadn't noticed her enter the room, and she had heard him whispering to the empty chair where Margaret used to sit during their morning coffee. "I can't do this without you, Maggie," he had said, his voice broken. "I don't know how to take care of her. I don't know how to take care of anything." That was when Elena began taking care of everything herself. The transition hadn't been sudden. At first, Robert would pull himself together for days at a time, trying to maintain the routines Margaret had established. He would check on the household, accounts, ensure Elena had what she needed for her daily lessons with Mrs. Whitmore, and even attempt to cook the simple meals Margaret had taught him. But grief had a way of eroding a person's foundation, like water wearing away stone, and slowly, inevitably, the man Eleanor had known as her strong, principled father began to crumble. The first sign of real trouble came when Eleanor discovered gambling. Markers hidden in her father's coat pocket. Small amounts at first, money lost in friendly poker games at Murphy's saloon, an attempt to find company and distraction from his sorrow. But grief and whiskey made dangerous companions, and what began as harmless entertainment quickly spiraled into desperate attempts to escape reality. Elena learned to forge her father's signature on household expense forms, ensuring their bills were paid before Robert could spend the money at the gambling tables. She took over the cooking, cleaning, and laundry, watching helplessly as their savings dwindled and their social standing in Silver Creek began to slide. The house on Prosperity Hill, once pristine and welcoming, began to show signs of neglect. Paint peeled from the shutters. The garden Margaret had tended so carefully grew wild with weeds, and neighbours who had once stopped by for afternoon tea began crossing the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore, Elena's former teacher and one of Margaret's closest friends, tried to intervene. She would arrive unannounced with baskets of food and gentle suggestions that Robert might benefit from speaking with Pastor Williams, or perhaps taking a position with less responsibility than mine foreman. But Robert had become defensive about his condition, interpreting every offer of help as judgment or pity. "We don't need charity, Adelaide," Elena remembered him saying during one particularly tense encounter. "The Hayes family has always taken care of itself." But they weren't taking care of themselves. Elena was taking care of everything, while Robert sank deeper into bottles and betting tables. The mine owners, initially sympathetic to their foreman's grief, began to lose patience as Robert's work suffered. He arrived late, left early, and made crucial errors in judgment that put other workers at risk. Elena overheard neighbours discussing his condition in hushed tones at the general store, their voices mixing pity with concern. "Poor Elena," Mrs. Patterson had whispered to the shopkeeper. "That girl's trying to hold everything together while her father drowns himself in Murphy's back room. Someone should do something." But what could anyone do? In 1883, a man's family was his responsibility. Alone and interference in domestic matters was considered unseemly. Elena was trapped, watching her father destroy himself, while she struggled to maintain the facade that everything was normal. The final blow to their respectability came when Robert lost his position at the mine. Elena learned about his dismissal, not from her father, but from Mrs. Whitmore, who had heard it from her husband, one of the mine's investors. "I'm so sorry, dear," Mrs. Whitmore had said, her kind eyes filled with worry. "Perhaps this will be the wake-up call your father needs. Sometimes people have to hit bottom before they can begin climbing back up, but Robert Hayes hadn't hit bottom yet. He had much further to fall. Without his foreman's salary, the family's financial situation became desperate. Elena sold her mother's jewelry piece by piece, starting with the items that held the least sentimental value, and working her way up to pieces that broke her heart to part with. Each transaction at the pawn shop felt like losing another piece of her mother, another connection to the life they had once shared. She took in sewing work, using her mother's skills to earn what little money she could. Her fingers grew raw from long hours with needle and thread, working by candlelight to save on lamp oil. The fine dresses she had once worn to church and social events were altered and re-altered until they could no longer hide their age and wear. Robert, meanwhile, had discovered a new source of funds. Credit from the saloon and gambling hall owners who were happy to extend loans to a man whose family still owned property on Prosperity Hill. These men, Elena would later learn, were not motivated by kindness or sympathy. They were investors in human misery, waiting patiently for their debtors to reach the point of complete desperation. The leader of this group was Vincent Castellano, a man who had arrived in Silver Creek claiming to be an entrepreneur interested in expanding business opportunities for the growing town. He dressed well, spoke eloquently, and had quickly ingratiated himself with several prominent families. What wasn't immediately apparent was that Castellano's primary business was acquiring assets from desperate people at fractions of their true value. He extended credit generously to men like Robert Hayes, men whose grief or vice had made them vulnerable to exploitation. The terms seemed reasonable at first: low interest rates, flexible payment schedules, and understanding when circumstances made prompt payment difficult. But buried in the carefully worded contracts were clauses that allowed Castellano to demand full payment at any time and to claim collateral that far exceeded the original debt. Elena first became aware of Castellano's involvement in their lives when she noticed official-looking documents appearing among her father's papers. When she asked about them, Robert became evasive and defensive, insisting that everything was under control and that she needn't worry herself about business matters. But Elena had learned not to trust her father's assurances about anything involving money. She began paying closer attention to his activities, and what she discovered filled her with dread. Robert owed Castellano more than $3,000, a sum that would have taken him years to earn, even when he had steady employment. The debt had grown through a combination of gambling losses, borrowed living expenses, and the compounding interest that Castellano charged on overdue accounts. Most terrifying of all, the collateral for the loan was their house and everything in it. Everything, Elena realized with dawning horror, including her. The legal language was complex, but the meaning was clear. If Robert couldn't repay his debt, by the specified date, Castellano would have the right to claim all Hayes family assets, including any unmarried daughters, who could be arranged in marriage to settle outstanding obligations. Elena confronted her father the night she discovered the true extent of his debt. She found him in his study, slumped over the desk, with an empty bottle beside him, and she shook him awake with shaking hands. "Papa," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Papa, you need to explain these papers to me. You need to tell me what you've done." Robert looked up with bleary, unfocused eyes, and for a moment Elena saw a flicker of the man he used to be, the father who had once protected her from thunderstorms and taught her to identify constellations. "I'm sorry, Elena," he whispered, tears beginning to flow. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. I thought I could win it back. I thought I could fix everything, make it like it was before your mama died." "How much time do we have?" Elena asked, forcing herself to remain calm, even as her world collapsed around her. 2 weeks, Robert said, his voice barely audible. "The payment is due in 2 weeks, and I don't have it. I don't have anything left to sell or trade or bet. I've lost everything. Elena, I've lost everything, and now I'm going to lose you too." Elena spent that night sitting by her bedroom window, looking out over Silver Creek, and trying to understand how her life had come to this point. The town, spread out below, looked peaceful in the moonlight, with warm yellow lights glowing in windows, and smoke rising from chimneys. It was hard to believe that somewhere in those quiet streets lived a man who considered her father's daughter to be collateral for a gambling debt. She thought about running away, but where could she go? A young woman traveling alone would face dangers far worse than an unwanted marriage arrangement. She had no relatives to turn to, no friends with the means to help her escape this situation. Mrs. Whitmore would surely try to help if Elena asked. But what could a teacher's widow do against a man like Castellano? As dawn broke over the mountains, surrounding Silver Creek, Elena made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not run from this situation. She would not beg or plead or hope for rescue from others. She would face whatever came with dignity and strength, just as her mother would have done. But first, she would make sure that when the time came, she would be ready for whatever fate awaited her. Elena spent the next 2 weeks preparing herself for the unknown. She practiced walking with perfect posture, speaking with confidence, and maintaining composure under pressure. She studied the town's social dynamics, learning everything she could about the various families and their business, relationships. Most importantly, she began to develop a plan that might, if she was very lucky and very clever, allow her to maintain some control over her own destiny. She had noticed that Castellano wasn't the only powerful man in Silver Creek with an interest in acquiring valuable assets. There were others, men with more money and perhaps more honor than the man who currently held her father's debt. The question was whether any of them would consider a desperate young woman worth their attention, and whether Eleanor could find the courage to approach them when the moment came. As the deadline approached, Elena prepared herself for the possibility that her childhood was about to end, and her real life, whatever form it might take, was about to begin. The morning of the auction dawned grey and bitter, with snow threatening in the heavy clouds that hung over Silver Creek like a funeral shroud. Eleanor stood before her mother's mirror, braiding her dark hair with steady hands, despite the tremor in her heart. She had chosen her mother's best dress, deep blue wool with pearl buttons, understanding that this might be the last time she would wear something that connected her to the woman she had been. The auction notice had appeared on the courthouse steps 3 days earlier, written in Castellano's careful script and validated by Judge Morrison's reluctant signature. "Public sale to satisfy outstanding debts," read the headline, followed by a clinical listing of the Hayes property and possessions. At the bottom, in smaller print that somehow seemed to scream louder than the bold headers, were the words that had made Elena's blood run cold. One unmarried female, aged 19, skilled in domestic arts, to be wed according to territorial law. She had read those words over and over, trying to make them feel real. In 3 hours, she would stand on the courthouse steps while men bid on the right to marry her, as if she were livestock or furniture. The legal framework was disturbingly thorough. Castellano had ensured that everything would be conducted according to Montana territorial law, which allowed for such arrangements when settling substantial debts. Elena pinned her mother's cameo brooch at her throat, a small act of rebellion that gave her courage. If she was to be sold like property, she would at least carry a piece of her true heritage with her. Downstairs, she found her father slumped at the kitchen table, unshaven and hollow-eyed. He had been sober for 2 days now, not by choice, but because Castellano had cut off his credit at every establishment in town. The enforced sobriety had brought clarity, but with it came the full weight of understanding what he had done to his daughter. "Elena," he said without looking up, "I need you to know that I never meant for this to happen. When I signed those papers, I thought you could gamble your way out of debt," Eleanor finished quietly. "You thought luck would save us instead of hard work and clear thinking." Robert flinched as if she had struck him. "I was trying to get back what we lost when your mother died. The money, the position, the respect. I thought if I could just win enough." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You would bring Mama back?" Elena sat across from him, studying the face that had once been so familiar and now seemed like a stranger's. "Papa, Mama isn't coming back. She never was coming back. And now you've traded away the one thing she left behind that truly mattered. Me." The words hung between them like a physical barrier. Robert reached across the table as if to take her hand, but Eleanor pulled back. She had forgiven him many things over the past 2 years, but this was beyond forgiveness. This was betrayal of the deepest kind. "There might be a way," Robert said desperately. Castellano mentioned that if the right bidder came forward, someone with real money and good standing, the arrangement could be favorable, a proper marriage with protections built in. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Favorable? Papa, you're talking about selling your daughter to the highest bidder and calling it favorable because the cage might be gilded." She stood and smoothed her skirts, preparing to leave for what might be the last conversation she would ever have with her father as a free woman. "I want you to know that whatever happens today, I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because Mama would want me to. But I also want you to know that the man who raised me, the father who taught me to be strong and proud and independent, that man died in the mine collapse with Mama. You're just what's left behind." The walk to the courthouse felt like a funeral procession. Elena held her head high, nodding politely to the neighbors who had gathered along the route. Some watched with obvious pity, others with the barely concealed excitement that accompanies public tragedy. Mrs. Whitmore stood on her porch, tears streaming down her face, and Elena paused to speak with her. "I've sent word to my sister in Denver," Mrs. Whitmore whispered urgently. "If you can somehow delay this proceeding, she might be able to help." "It's too late for that," Elena replied gently. "But thank you for trying. Please remember me as I was, not as I'm about to become." The courthouse square was already crowded when Elena arrived. Word of the unusual auction had spread throughout Silver Creek and the surrounding settlements, drawing curious onlookers and, more ominously, potential bidders. Elena recognized several men in the crowd, widowers, prosperous merchants, and a few rough-looking individuals who made her skin crawl with their calculating stares. Castellano stood near the courthouse steps, impeccably dressed as always, overseeing the proceedings with the efficiency of a man who had conducted such business many times before. When he saw Eleanor approach, he smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Miss Hayes," he said with a slight bow, "I trust you understand the proceedings today. Everything will be conducted in strict accordance with territorial law. The gentleman who successfully bids will enter into a legal marriage contract with you, witnessed and recorded by Judge Morrison." "I understand that you're selling a human being," Elena replied steadily. "I understand that you've found a legal way to engage in slavery." Castellano's smile faltered slightly. Now, Miss Hayes, this is simply a business transaction designed to satisfy your father's legitimate debts. Marriage is a time-honored institution, after all. You might find yourself quite happily situated when this is all concluded." Elena studied the crowd gathering around them. She recognized most of the faces. Silver Creek was a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. There was Edgar Pruitt, the widowed banker whose wife had died in childbirth the previous year. He was a decent enough man, though 30 years her senior and with a reputation for penny pinching that bordered on cruelty. Near the back of the crowd stood Marcus Webb, a prosperous merchant who had been known to frequent the establishments, where young women worked under questionable circumstances. The thought of being legally bound to such a man made Elena's stomach turn, but it was the group of strangers that concerned her most. 3 men she had never seen before, dressed in expensive clothing that marked them as outsiders with serious money. One was, perhaps 40, with the soft look of a man who had never done physical labor. Another was younger, but had the hard eyes of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. The third kept to himself, observing everything with the detached interest of a man evaluating livestock. "Who are those men?" Elena asked Castellano, nodding toward the strangers. "Business associates from other territories," Castellano replied, smoothly. "Word of today's proceedings has traveled, and there are always men of means looking for suitable arrangements." The implication was clear. These weren't local men who might be swayed by community pressure to treat her with some measure of respect. These were strangers who could take her away from everything she had ever known, to places where no one would know her story or care about her welfare. Judge Morrison emerged from the courthouse, his face grim with distaste for the proceedings he was legally obligated to oversee. Elena had known Judge Morrison since childhood. He had been her father's friend and had officiated at her parents' wedding. The fact that he was now required to auction her off to satisfy gambling debts was a cruel irony that wasn't lost on either of them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Morrison called out, his voice carrying reluctantly across the crowd, "we are here today to conduct a public sale in accordance with Montana territorial law for the purpose of satisfying the legitimate debts of Robert Hayes, formerly of this county." Elena took her position on the courthouse steps, feeling exposed and vulnerable under the stares of the assembled crowd. She focused on a point above their heads, trying to maintain dignity in the face of this ultimate degradation. The first item for auction, Judge Morrison continued, consulting his papers, is the Hayes family residence on Prosperity Hill, including all furnishings and household goods. Elena half listened as her childhood home was sold to Edgar Pruitt for far less than its true value. The house where she had learned to walk, where her mother had taught her to sew and cook and dream of her future, all of it transferred to a stranger's ownership with the simple fall of the judge's gavel. Next came her father's tools, his books, and her mother's personal effects. Each item represented a piece of her life being stripped away, sold to people who would never understand their true value. Mrs. Patterson bought her mother's sewing machine for a fraction of what it was worth. The minister's wife purchased the family Bible that had been passed down through 3 generations of Hayes women. Then came the moment Elena had been dreading. The final item, Judge Morrison announced, his voice barely above a whisper, is the marriage arrangement for Miss Elena Hayes, age 19, skilled in domestic arts and of good moral character. Bidding will begin at $50. The crowd fell silent for a moment, as if they even understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Then Edgar Pruitt's voice rang out. $50. 75, called one of the strangers, the soft-looking man with calculating eyes. 100, bid Marcus Webb, and Elena suppressed a shudder. The bidding continued in steady increments, the price of Elena's future rising with each called number. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her composure. $200, called the hard-eyed stranger, and several of the local bidders stepped back. That was more money than most of them saw in 6 months. $250, counted the third stranger, speaking for the first time. Elena found herself studying this man more carefully. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his late 20s, with the weathered look of someone who spent time outdoors. Unlike his companions, who watched the proceedings with obvious appetite, he seemed almost reluctant to participate. 300, called the hard-eyed man, clearly determined to win. 400, came the immediate response from the younger stranger. A murmur ran through the crowd. $400 was an enormous sum, more than many families in Silver Creek earned in an entire year. Elena realized with growing alarm that these men weren't simply looking for wives. They were bidding the kind of money that suggested other, darker purposes. $500. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, and every head turned to identify this new bidder. Elena's heart stopped as she saw who had spoken. Standing, slightly apart from the main group, was a man she had never seen before, but whose presence commanded immediate attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the fine clothes of someone with serious wealth, but his bearing suggested strength and confidence rather than soft living. Most remarkably, his face showed none of the calculating hunger that characterized the other bidders. Instead, he looked angry, not at Elena, but at the entire proceeding. $500, Judge Morrison repeated, clearly surprised by both the amount and the bidder. 600, counted the hard-eyed stranger, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. $1,000, the new bidder said calmly, and the crowd gasped. Elena stared at this mysterious man who had just bid an enormous sum for the right to marry her. He met her gaze steadily, and she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in any of the other bidders: respect. He was looking at her as if she were a person rather than property. The other bidders fell silent. $1,000 was beyond their reach, and they knew it. Castellano himself looked shaken by the sum, clearly not having expected the bidding to reach such heights. "Do I hear any other bids?" Judge Morrison asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. The silence stretched for a long moment, and then Judge Morrison raised his gavel. "Sold," he said quietly, "to—" He paused, realizing he didn't know the winning bidder's name. "Nathaniel." "Blackwood," the man said, stepping forward. "And I'll want the marriage conducted immediately, with proper witnesses and documentation." Elena's knees nearly buckled as the reality hit her. In the space of 10 minutes, she had been sold to a complete stranger for an amount of money that boggled her mind. But as Nathaniel Blackwood approached the courthouse steps, she saw something in his expression that gave her a glimmer of hope. He wasn't looking at her like he had just purchased property. He was looking at her like he had just prevented something terrible from happening to someone who didn't deserve it. The question was, what did he expect in return? The marriage ceremony took place 30 minutes later in Judge Morrison's chambers, with only the legally required witnesses present. Elena stood beside Nathaniel Blackwood, her hand trembling slightly as she signed the marriage certificate that would forever change her identity from Elena Hayes to Elena Blackwood. The ink was still wet when her new husband turned to address the small gathering. "Gentlemen," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying an authority that commanded immediate attention, "I want to make something perfectly clear. Mrs. Blackwood is now under my protection, and anyone who approaches her with dishonorable intentions will answer to me personally." His gaze swept across the room, lingering meaningfully on the disappointed bidders who had lingered to observe the ceremony. The hard-eyed stranger who had bid against him shifted uncomfortably and muttered something about catching the next stage out of town. Elena watched this exchange with growing curiosity about the man who had just become her husband. Everything about Nathaniel Blackwood suggested wealth and power, but more importantly, he seemed to understand that she was a person deserving of respect rather than property to be claimed. After the ceremony concluded and the witnesses dispersed, Elena found herself alone with Nathaniel in the judge's chambers. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of their extraordinary circumstances. "Mrs. Blackwood," Nathaniel began, then stopped himself. "I apologize. What would you prefer to be called?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. In all her fears about this day, she had never imagined her purchaser asking for her preferences about anything. "Elena is fine," she said quietly. "I suppose I should ask what you prefer to be called as well. Nathaniel, or Nate if you prefer." He studied her face carefully. "I imagine you have questions about what happens now." Elena straightened her shoulders, calling upon the dignity her mother had taught her. "I assume you'll tell me what you expect from this arrangement. I'm prepared to honor the legal obligations of marriage, whatever form you require them to take." Something flickered in Nathaniel's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or admiration for her directness. "The first thing you should know is that this marriage, while legally binding, doesn't require anything from you that you're not willing to give freely. You'll have your own accommodations, your own resources, and your own choices about how you spend your time." Eleanor stared at him, wondering if she had misunderstood. "I don't understand. You paid an enormous sum for the right to marry me. Surely you expect something in return." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "What I expect is to prevent you from ending up in a situation that would have destroyed you. What I hope for is that, given time and respect, we might build something genuine between us. But I won't demand anything from you, Elena. Not your affection, not your domestic service, and certainly not your physical compliance." The relief that washed over Elena was so intense it nearly brought her to tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "Because," Nathaniel said simply, "I've seen what happens to women who are treated as property rather than partners. And because sometimes doing the right thing is reason enough." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the chamber door. Castellano entered without waiting for permission, his earlier composure replaced by obvious agitation. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "there are certain additional terms of the Hayes debt that we need to discuss. The marriage arrangement was only part of the settlement." Nathaniel turned to face Castellano with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to dealing with predators. Mr. Castellano, isn't it? I believe our business concluded when you accepted my payment in full. What additional terms could there possibly be? Castellano's smile was cold and calculated. The Hayes property included certain ongoing obligations. Robert Hayes signed agreements that extend beyond today's auction. There are performance guarantees, future considerations, and territorial business arrangements that transfer with the family assets. Elena felt her heart sink as she realized that even marriage to Nathaniel might not free her from Castellano's web of legal manipulation. "What kind of agreements?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Your father was quite accommodating when he needed additional credit," Castellano replied smoothly. "He signed several documents giving me certain rights to Hayes family labor and cooperation in various business ventures. These rights don't disappear simply because ownership has changed hands." Nathaniel stepped forward, and Elena could sense the dangerous edge beneath his calm exterior. "Are you suggesting that you have some continuing claim on my wife?" "I'm stating a legal fact, Mr. Blackwood. These contracts were properly witnessed and filed with the territorial government. Mrs. Blackwood's father committed her to certain obligations that persist regardless of her marital status." Elena watched as Nathaniel pulled a leather portfolio from his coat and extracted several official-looking documents. "As it happens, Mr. Castellano, I took the liberty of researching the Hayes debt situation before attending today's auction. What I found was quite interesting." Castellano's confident expression began to falter as Nathaniel spread the papers on Judge Morrison's desk. "These are copies of all contracts between you and Robert Hayes, obtained from the territorial records office in Helena," Nathaniel continued. "What's fascinating is how many of these agreements violate territorial lending laws. The interest rates alone exceed legal limits by substantial margins." Elena watched Castellano's face grow pale as Nathaniel continued his methodical dismantling of the man's carefully constructed schemes. "More interesting still," Nathaniel said, producing another set of documents. "Are these reports from law enforcement agencies in 3 other territories, detailing similar operations run by one Vincent Castellano? It seems you have quite a history of exploiting desperate families through predatory lending practices." The room fell silent except for the sound of Castellano's increasingly rapid breathing. Elena realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Her new husband had come prepared not just to rescue her, but to destroy the man who had orchestrated her family's downfall. "Now then," Nathaniel said, his voice remaining conversational despite the devastating nature of his revelations, "let's discuss what's going to happen next. You're going to cancel all claims against the Hayes family, including any supposed ongoing obligations. You're going to return any property or assets you've illegally acquired through fraudulent contracts, and you're going to leave Silver Creek within 24 hours, never to return." Castellano sputtered in outrage. "You can't simply dismiss legally binding contracts. I have rights under territorial law. Rights that evaporate when the contracts themselves are proven fraudulent," Nathaniel replied. He pulled out one final document. "This is a warrant for your arrest, issued by the Territorial Marshal's Office. I can have you taken into custody immediately, or you can accept my generous offer to leave quietly." Elena stared at the warrant, realizing that Nathaniel's rescue of her had been far more planned and comprehensive than she had initially understood. "You knew," she said. "You knew about Castellano before you came here today." Nathaniel turned to her, his expression gentling. "I received word about today's auction from business associates who were concerned about Castellano's activities in this region. When I learned that an innocent young woman was being sold to satisfy her father's gambling debts, I felt obligated to intervene." "But why?" Elena asked. "Why would my situation matter to someone I'd never met?" The question seemed to touch something deep in Nathaniel's expression. For a moment, his careful composure slipped, revealing a pain that Elena recognized from her own recent experiences. "Because," he said quietly, "I've seen what happens when good people are destroyed by predators like Castellano, and because I was in a position to prevent it from happening again." Castellano, meanwhile, had been weighing his options and clearly found them all unacceptable. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he said, gathering his papers with shaking hands. "You may have legal documents, but I have connections throughout this territory. People who won't appreciate outside interference in local business arrangements." "Mr. Castellano," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying a note of genuine amusement, "I don't think you understand who you're threatening. Allow me to clarify something for you." He pulled out a business card and handed it to Castellano, who read it with growing alarm. "Blackwood Cattle Company," Nathaniel continued, "is the largest livestock operation in 3 territories. We employ over 200 people, own more than 50,000 acres of grazing land, and maintain business relationships with territorial governments from here to California. When we have problems with individuals who threaten our interests or our people, those problems tend to be resolved quickly and permanently." Elena watched Castellano's face as the full implications of Nathaniel's identity became clear. She had married not just a wealthy man, but the heir to what appeared to be a commercial empire. "Furthermore," Nathaniel added, "my father serves on the Territorial Development Council, and my brother is a federal judge. The connections you mentioned, they're likely people who depend on Blackwood business for their livelihoods." The threat was delivered with such calm professionalism that it took Elena a moment to realize she had just witnessed her husband casually dismantling a man's entire criminal enterprise. Castellano made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Even if you can nullify my contracts with Hayes, you can't undo what's already been done. That girl's reputation in this town is ruined. Everyone knows she was sold like livestock. What kind of life can she have here now?" Elena felt. The words hit her like physical blows. In her relief at being rescued from immediate danger, she hadn't fully considered the long-term social consequences of what had happened. Castellano was right. Everyone in Silver Creek would forever remember her as the girl whose father had sold her to pay gambling debts. But Nathaniel's response surprised her once again. "Elena won't be staying in Silver Creek," he said. "She'll be coming with me to the Blackwood Ranch in Wyoming Territory, where she'll be introduced as my wife and treated with the respect that title deserves. As for her reputation here, I suspect people's memories will improve considerably once they understand the consequences of spreading malicious gossip about a member of the Blackwood family." Elena realized that her rescue was more complete than she had dared to hope. Not only was she being freed from Castellano's schemes, but she was being offered an entirely new life in a place where no one would know her story unless she chose to share it. Castellano must have reached the same conclusion because his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Fine," he said bitterly. "You win this round, Blackwood, but don't think this makes you some kind of hero. You've just bought yourself an expensive problem. That girl comes from nothing, has no education in proper society, and will embarrass you the moment you try to introduce her to people of your own class." Elena felt the familiar sting of shame at Castellano's words. But before she could respond, Nathaniel stepped between them. "Mr. Castellano," he said, his voice now carrying an edge of real danger, "you have 30 seconds to leave this room before I forget my commitment to handling this situation civilly. And if I ever hear that you've spoken disrespectfully about my wife again, our next conversation will be very different." Castellano gathered his remaining papers and left without another word. But Elena could see the hatred in his eyes as he departed. She had been rescued, but she suspected she had also made a powerful enemy. After Castellano's departure, Elena found herself alone with Nathaniel once again, trying to process everything that had just happened. "I need to ask you something," she said, gathering her courage. "That man was right about one thing. I don't come from the same world you do. I don't know how to be the wife of someone important. What happens when your family realizes what you've done?" Nathaniel considered her question seriously. "My family will judge you by your character, not your circumstances. But I won't lie to you. There will be challenges. Some people in our social circle may be initially skeptical or even hostile. But you'll have time to prepare, and you'll have my full support." Eleanor thought about the implications of joining Nathaniel's world. "What about my father? I can't just abandon him, despite what he's done." "We'll make arrangements for his care," Nathaniel assured her. "There are facilities that specialize in helping people overcome drinking problems. If he's willing to accept help, we'll make sure he gets it." The generosity of the offer overwhelmed Elena. This man had already done more for her family than anyone had a right to expect, and he was offering even more. "Why are you being so kind to us?" she asked. "There has to be more to this than simple charity." Nathaniel walked to the window, looking out at the town where Eleanor's old life was already becoming a memory. "There is more," he admitted. "But it's not something I'm ready to discuss today. For now, it's enough to say that I believe in second chances, and that sometimes the right thing to do is also the thing that serves your own interests." Elena joined him at the window, studying his profile as he watched the street below. "When do we leave for Wyoming?" "Tomorrow morning," Nathaniel replied. "I've already arranged accommodations for tonight at the hotel, and Mrs. Patterson from the general store has agreed to help you select appropriate traveling clothes and personal items." Elena realized that Nathaniel had been planning this rescue in extraordinary detail. "How long have you been preparing for today?" 3 weeks, he said simply, "from the moment I learned what Castellano was planning to do to you." The revelation that a stranger had spent weeks planning to save her from a fate she had only recently learned about herself was almost too much to comprehend. Elena found herself studying this man who had just turned her world upside down in the most positive way possible. "Nathaniel," she said, using his name for the first time, "I want you to know that whatever your reasons for helping me, I'm grateful. And I promise you that I'll do everything I can to prove worthy of the chance you're giving me." He turned from the window to look at her, and Elena saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. Not desire or possession, but genuine respect, and perhaps the beginning of real affection. "Elena," he said, "you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You've already shown more courage and dignity in the past few hours than most people show in a lifetime. I have no doubt that you'll thrive in your new life." As they left the courthouse together, Elena caught sight of her reflection in the building's windows. The frightened girl who had entered that morning was gone, replaced by a woman walking beside her husband toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The old Elena Hayes had died on the courthouse steps. Elena Blackwood was about to be born. The stage coach journey from Silver Creek to Cheyenne took 4 days, winding through mountain passes and across vast prairies that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Elena sat across from Nathaniel in the well-appointed private coach he had hired, watching the landscape of her old life disappear behind them with each mile they traveled. On the first day, their conversation remained formal and cautious. Elena was acutely aware that despite their legal marriage, she was essentially traveling alone with a stranger whose true nature remained largely unknown to her. Nathaniel seemed to understand her discomfort and maintained a respectful distance, focusing their discussions on practical matters about their destination and her immediate needs. "The Blackwood Ranch covers nearly 60,000 acres, he explained, as they passed through a particularly scenic valley. "We run about 15,000 head of cattle, along with horses and sheep. The main house sits on a bluff overlooking the Sweetwater River, about 20 miles from the nearest town." Elena tried to imagine such vastness. The Hayes farm in Silver Creek had been barely 40 acres, and she had thought that substantial. How many people live there? The main house has a permanent staff of about a dozen. Cook, housekeeper, stable hands and such. During roundup season, we employ nearly 50 additional men. Then there are the line shacks scattered across the property, each manned by 2 or 3 hands year-round. The scale of the operation was beyond anything Elena had ever imagined. It sounds more like a small town than a ranch. In many ways, it is, Nathaniel agreed. We have our own blacksmith shop, a school for the workers' children, and even a small medical facility. My mother insisted that after too many accidents went untreated because the nearest doctor was days away. The mention of his mother made Elena's stomach tighten with anxiety. Tell me about your family. What should I expect when we arrive? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, and Elena sensed she had touched on something complicated. My father built the ranch from nothing over the past 30 years. He's a hard man in many ways, but fair. He believes in judging people by their actions rather than their circumstances. And your mother? My mother died 5 years ago, Nathaniel said quietly. Pneumonia. She was a remarkable woman, very kind, very strong. She would have liked you. Elena heard the pain in his voice and understood that his mother's death was still a fresh wound. I'm sorry for your loss. What about other family members? My younger brother Daniel is a federal judge, as I mentioned. He lives in Denver with his wife and 2 children. My sister Rebecca lives at the ranch. She's 23 and has been managing the household since Mother died. She's formidable. The way Nathaniel said formidable suggested that Elena might face some challenges from this sister. Will she resent my presence? Rebecca has very strong opinions about most things, Nathaniel said diplomatically. She's been expecting me to marry someone from our social circle for years. Your arrival will certainly surprise her. Elena felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Perhaps you should have warned her about our marriage. I sent a telegram from the last town, Nathaniel replied, but I kept the details brief. Rebecca will learn about our circumstances when we arrive. The second day of their journey brought them into open prairie country, where the sky seemed impossibly vast, and the wind carried scents Eleanor had never experienced. Sagebrush, wild, a grass, and something clean and untamed that spoke of unlimited space and freedom. As they traveled, Eleanor began to notice changes in Nathaniel's demeanor. The formal politeness of their first day was giving way to something more genuine, and she found herself responding in kind. Their conversations became longer and more personal, touching on subjects beyond the immediate practicalities of their situation. I should probably warn you, Nathaniel said as they shared a simple lunch at a way station, that life on the ranch can be quite isolated, especially during winter months. The nearest neighbors are 15 miles away, and social gatherings are infrequent. I hope you won't find it too lonely. Elena considered this. After the past 2 years in Silver Creek, isolation might be a blessing. I've grown tired of being the subject of constant gossip and speculation. You won't face that kind of scrutiny at the ranch, Nathaniel assured her. The people who work for us are loyal and discreet. They're more concerned with doing their jobs well than with spreading rumors. What will my role be? Elena asked. I understand that I'll have my own accommodations, but surely there are expectations about how a rancher's wife should contribute to the operation. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Respect mixed with curiosity. What would you like your role to be? The question caught Eleanor off guard. I'm not sure anyone has ever asked me that before. Well, I'm asking now. You're intelligent, capable, and from what I observed in Silver Creek, you have excellent organizational skills. The ranch could benefit from your talents in several areas, but only if that's something you want to pursue. Elena felt a flutter of excitement at the possibility of meaningful work. What kind of areas? We maintain detailed records of breeding lines, feed costs, seasonal employment, and financial projections. The bookkeeping alone is a substantial task. We also coordinate supply deliveries, manage correspondence with buyers and business partners, and oversee the educational programs for workers' families. The scope of administrative work was far more complex than anything Elena had encountered, but it sounded fascinating rather than daunting. "I'd like to learn about all of it," she said. "I may not be qualified yet, but I'm willing to work hard to become useful." "Elena," Nathaniel said seriously, "you're already useful. More than that, you're valuable. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The third day brought them into Wyoming territory proper, and Elena began to understand why. Nathaniel spoke of the ranch with such pride. The landscape was breathtaking in its scope and beauty, rolling hills covered with rich grass, crystal-clear streams cutting through valleys, and in the distance, snow-capped mountains that looked like they had been painted against the sky. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, pressing her face to the coach window. "I never imagined country could be so vast and open." "Wait until you see it at sunrise," Nathaniel replied, his voice warm with affection for his homeland. "The light comes across the prairie like liquid gold, and you can see for 50 miles in every direction." As they traveled deeper into Blackwood territory, Elena began to see evidence of the family's influence. They passed herds of cattle bearing the distinctive Blackwood brand, well-maintained fences and buildings, and workers who recognized Nathaniel's coach and waved respectfully as they passed. "How did your father build all this from nothing?" Elena asked, genuinely curious about the family history she was now part of. Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful. "He arrived in Wyoming territory in 1852 with $100, a team of oxen, and an unshakable belief that hard work would eventually pay off. He spent his first winter in a dugout shelter, nearly died of scurvy, and lost half his cattle to wolves and harsh weather." "What kept him going?" "Stubbornness, mostly," Nathaniel said with a slight smile. "That and a promise he made to my mother before they married. He told her he would build something lasting, something their children could be proud of. Every time he was tempted to give up, he remembered that promise." Elena thought about the dedication required to transform wilderness into the thriving operation they were approaching. "Your mother must have been an extraordinary woman to inspire such devotion." "She was," Nathaniel agreed. "She taught school back in Ohio before they married, and she brought that same dedication to improving life on the frontier. She started the first library in 3 counties, established the school for workers' children, and convinced my father to build the medical facility I mentioned." "She sounds like someone I would have admired." "I think you two would have understood each other," Nathaniel said quietly. "She also came from difficult circumstances and had to prove herself worthy of a place in society that wasn't initially welcoming." Elena sensed there was more to this story, but before she could ask, their coach crested a hill and the Blackwood Ranch spread out before them. The sight took Elena's breath away. The main house was a magnificent 3-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings stretched in all directions, barns, corrals, workshops, and what appeared to be a small village of houses for the workers and their families. The Sweetwater River curved around the property like a silver ribbon, and beyond it, pastures stretched to the horizon, dotted with grazing cattle and horses. "My God," Elena whispered, "it's like a small kingdom." "In many ways it is," Nathaniel replied. "We're largely self-sufficient here. We generate our own power with water wheels, grow much of our own food, and manufacture most of what we need." As their coach approached the main house, Elena could see people emerging to observe their arrival. A woman appeared on the veranda, tall, elegant, and clearly accustomed to command. Even from a distance, Elena could see the family resemblance to Nathaniel in her bearing and features. "That's Rebecca," Nathaniel said, following Elena's gaze. "She's been running the household since Mother died, and she's very good at it. She may seem intimidating at first, but she's fair-minded once she gets to know you." Elena smoothed her traveling dress and checked her hair in the small mirror from her reticule. She was about to meet the woman who would either welcome her as a sister or view her as an unwelcome intruder in the family she had been protecting. The coach pulled to a stop in front of the house, and Nathaniel stepped out first, then turned to help Elena down. As her feet touched the ground, she found herself standing in front of the most impressive home she had ever seen, about to be introduced to people who would judge her fitness to be part of their world. Rebecca Blackwood descended the veranda steps with the confident stride of a woman accustomed to being in charge. She was beautiful in a strong patrician way, with dark hair like Nathaniel's and the same intelligent grey eyes. Her dress was elegant but practical, and she wore it with the natural grace of someone born to privilege. "Nathaniel," she said, embracing her brother warmly. "Welcome home. Your telegram was rather cryptic, something about bringing a guest." "Rebecca," Nathaniel replied, turning to include Elena in the conversation. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Elena." "Elena, this is my sister Rebecca." The silence that followed this introduction seemed to stretch for an eternity. Elena watched Rebecca's face process this information, seeing surprise give way to shock and then to something harder to read. "Your wife," Rebecca repeated slowly. "I see. How unexpected." Elena stepped forward, calling upon every lesson in deportment her mother had ever taught her. "Miss Blackwood, I'm pleased to meet you. I hope you'll forgive the suddenness of our arrival. The circumstances of our marriage were rather unusual." Rebecca's gaze swept over Eleanor, taking in her simple traveling dress, her nervous posture, and what Elena was certain must be obvious signs of her humble origins. "Indeed," Rebecca said coolly. "Well, I suppose we should discuss these unusual circumstances inside. Mrs. Patterson, please prepare the blue guest room for our visitor." Elena felt the sting of being called a visitor rather than family, but Nathaniel intervened smoothly. "Elena will be staying in the East Wing Master Suite, Rebecca, and I'd appreciate it if the staff could be informed that Mrs. Blackwood is to be treated with the same respect accorded to any member of this family." The edge in Nathaniel's voice was subtle but unmistakable, and Rebecca clearly heard it. "Of course," she said, her tone becoming marginally warmer. "Mrs. Blackwood, welcome to the ranch. I'm sure you must be tired from your journey. Perhaps you'd like to rest before dinner?" "Thank you," Elena replied, grateful for the reprieve. "I would appreciate that." As they moved toward the house, Elena caught sight of several workers watching from various distances. She could see curiosity and speculation in their faces, but also something else, a reserved friendliness that suggested they were waiting to form their own judgments about the new Mrs. Blackwood. The interior of the house was even more impressive than its exterior. Rich wood paneling, beautiful furniture, and artwork that spoke of both wealth and refined taste filled the spacious rooms. Elena tried not to gawk as they passed through a grand foyer, an elegant parlor, and up a magnificent staircase to the second floor. "Your rooms are here," Nathaniel said, opening a door to reveal a suite that was larger than the entire Hayes house had been. "I'll have your things brought up, and Mrs. Patterson will assign you a personal maid if you'd like one." Elena stepped into what was now her private domain, marveling at the luxury that surrounded her. A massive four-poster bed dominated one wall, while tall windows offered breathtaking views of the river and mountains beyond. A sitting area with comfortable chairs and a writing desk occupied another corner, and through an open doorway she could see a private bathroom with amenities she had only dreamed of. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Thank you." "Dinner is at 7, Nathaniel said. "That will give you a few hours to rest and prepare. I should warn you that Rebecca will likely have many questions about our marriage. She's protective of the family's interests, but she's not cruel. Answer what you're comfortable answering, and don't feel obligated to justify yourself to anyone." After Nathaniel left, Elena sat on the edge of the magnificent bed and tried to process everything that had happened to her in the past few days. Less than a week ago, she had been a desperate young woman facing auction to pay her father's gambling debts. Now she was the wife of one of the wealthiest men in Wyoming Territory, living in luxury she could never have imagined. But she was also an outsider in a world where she didn't understand the rules, facing the scrutiny of people who had every reason to question her motives and suitability. The real test of her new life was just beginning. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. A young woman entered carrying Elena's few possessions and wearing a friendly smile. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Mary Sullivan, one of the housemaids. Mr. Nathaniel asked me to help you get settled and to serve as your personal maid, if that's agreeable to you." Elena looked at this cheerful young woman, probably only a few years younger than herself, and made her first decision as mistress of her new life. "I'd be grateful for your help, Mary," she said, "but I should warn you, I'm not accustomed to having personal service. You may need to teach me how to be a proper employer." Mary's smile broadened. "Don't you worry about that, Mum. We'll figure it out together. Now, what would you like to wear for dinner tonight? I understand it's something of a special occasion." Eleanor looked at her meager wardrobe and realized she was about to face her first major test as a member of the Blackwood family. Tonight's dinner would determine whether she could find a place in this new world or whether she would forever remain an outsider in her own home. Part 5. Proving Her Worth. The dinner that evening took place in the Blackwood family's formal dining room, a magnificent space with a table that could seat 20 people comfortably. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over polished silver and fine china, while oil paintings of family patriarchs gazed down from the walls with stern expressions that seemed to judge Elena's worthiness to join their lineage. Elena had chosen the best dress from her limited wardrobe, a deep green wool that had once been her mother's Sunday best. Mary Sullivan had worked miracles with Elena's hair, arranging it in an elegant style that complemented the dress, and had even provided a delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to Nathaniel's mother. "Mrs. Nathaniel always said pearls brought out the best in a woman," Mary had explained as she fastened the clasp. She'd be pleased to see them worn by someone worthy. Now, seated at the imposing dining table with Nathaniel on her right and Rebecca across from her, Elena tried to project confidence while navigating an array of silverware that seemed designed to intimidate newcomers to polite society. "So, Elena," Rebecca began, once the first course had been served, "Nathaniel's telegram mentioned that you're from Montana Territory. What part of the country?" "Silver Creek," Elena replied, carefully following Rebecca's lead with the appropriate fork. "It's a small mining town in the northern part of the territory." "Mining," Rebecca repeated, and Elena caught the slight tone of disdain. "How interesting. And your family? What was their involvement in the mining industry?" Elena felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, but Nathaniel's earlier words echoed in her mind. She didn't need to justify herself to anyone. "My father was a mine foreman before my mother's death. After that, he struggled with various difficulties." "I see," Rebecca said, clearly expecting more details. "And how did you meet my brother? Social gatherings in mining towns must be quite different from what we're accustomed to here." Eleanor met Rebecca's gaze steadily. "We met under unusual circumstances that I'd prefer not to discuss in detail tonight. Perhaps Nathaniel has shared some of those details with you privately." Nathaniel intervened smoothly. "Elena's situation in Silver Creek required immediate assistance, which I was fortunate to be able to provide. The specifics aren't important. Now, what matters is that she's here and that she's family." Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly at her brother's protective tone. "Of course, I'm simply trying to get to know our new family member better. Elena, what are your interests? What do you enjoy doing with your time?" Elena sensed this was another test, an opportunity to demonstrate whether she possessed the refined accomplishments expected of a lady in polite society. "I enjoy reading when good books are available. I'm also skilled with needlework and have some experience managing household accounts and correspondence." "Needlework," Rebecca said with slight surprise. "What type of needlework?" "Primarily practical sewing and mending, though my mother taught me some decorative embroidery before she died." Elena paused, then decided to take a small risk. "I noticed some beautiful needlepoint cushions in the parlor. The workmanship is exceptional." "Those were Mother's work," Rebecca said, her expression softening slightly. "She was quite accomplished with decorative arts." "Do you have examples of your own work?" Elena shook her head. "I'm afraid not. Most of my needlework over the past few years has been practical items for daily use, rather than decorative pieces." "Perhaps you'd be interested in seeing Mother's sewing room," Rebecca offered, and Elena detected the first note of genuine warmth in her voice. She left behind an extensive collection of patterns and materials. "If you're truly skilled with a needle, you might find them useful." "I would be honored," Elena replied sincerely. The conversation continued through several courses, with Rebecca gradually revealing more about the ranch's operations and Elena asking intelligent questions that demonstrated her genuine interest. In learning about her new home, Elena noticed that Nathaniel remained largely quiet during these exchanges, watching both women with an expression of cautious optimism. "Tomorrow," Rebecca said as dessert was served, "I'll show you around the main operations. The ranch is quite complex, and it will take time for you to understand how everything fits together. We'll start with the household management. Staff schedules, supply ordering, correspondence with business partners in Denver and Chicago." Elena felt a flutter of excitement. "That sounds fascinating. I'd also like to learn about the educational programs Nathaniel mentioned. Teaching children seems like valuable work." "You're interested in teaching?" Rebecca asked, her surprise evident. "My mother was a teacher before she married, and she always said education was the key to improving one's circumstances. If there's a way I can contribute to the children's learning, I'd very much like to try." Rebecca and Nathaniel exchanged a meaningful glance that Elena couldn't quite interpret. "Mother established the school program," Rebecca explained. "She believed that children of working families deserved the same educational opportunities as children from wealthy households. It's been one of her most enduring legacies." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Elena said quietly. "I hope I can find ways to honor her memory through useful contribution to the ranch." After dinner, Nathaniel excused himself to check on some ranch business, leaving Eleanor and Rebecca alone in the parlor. Eleanor expected the conversation to become more challenging without Nathaniel's protective presence, but instead, Rebecca seemed to relax slightly. "I owe you an apology," Rebecca said, settling into a comfortable chair near the fireplace. "I was cold to you when you arrived, and that was unfair. Nathaniel's telegram gave me no time to prepare for the news that he'd married, and I reacted poorly." Elena appreciated the honesty. "I understand your surprise. If someone had told me a week ago that I'd be sitting in this parlor as Mrs. Blackwood, I wouldn't have believed them. May I ask about those unusual circumstances Nathaniel mentioned? I'm concerned about his well-being, and I need to understand what brought you two together. Eleanor considered how much to reveal. My father accumulated substantial gambling debts, and the creditor arranged for me to be married to settle those obligations. Nathaniel intervened to prevent me from ending up in a dangerous situation. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. So this was a rescue rather than a romance? Yes, Elena said simply, though I hope it might become something more meaningful with time. And what are your intentions toward my brother? Are you hoping to profit from his generosity, or do you genuinely care about his welfare? The blunt question might have offended Elena a week ago, but she understood that Rebecca was protecting her family's interests. Miss Blackwood, a week ago I had nothing but the clothes I was wearing and the threat of being sold to a man who would have destroyed me. Your brother saved my life and asked nothing in return except that I treat our marriage with respect. I have no interest in taking advantage of his kindness and every intention of proving myself worthy of the chance he's given me. Rebecca studied Elena's face carefully. You know, you remind me of someone. Who? My mother, when she first arrived at this ranch 30 years ago. She came from humble circumstances in Ohio, and many people in the territory questioned whether she was suitable to be the wife of a successful rancher. She proved them wrong through hard work, intelligence, and genuine care for this family and everyone who worked for us. Eleanor felt a warm glow at the comparison. That's very kind of you. To say, it's not kindness, it's observation. You have her directness, her refusal to be intimidated by circumstances beyond your control, and I suspect you have her determination to make the best of whatever situation you find yourself in. The next morning brought Eleanor's first full day as a member of the Blackwood household. She woke before dawn, a habit formed during years of caring for her father and managing their failing household. From her bedroom window, she could see the ranch coming to life as workers began their daily routines, feeding livestock, milking cows, preparing for the day's activities. Mary Sullivan arrived with hot water for washing and helped Eleanor dress in the most practical outfit from her limited wardrobe. Miss Rebecca asked me to tell you she'll meet you in the breakfast room at 7, Mary said. She's usually up with the sun, getting reports from the foreman and planning the day's work. Elena found Rebecca in a sunny room overlooking the vegetable gardens, seated at a smaller table than the formal dining room and surrounded by ledgers, correspondence, and what appeared to be duty rosters for the household staff. She looked up as Elena entered, her expression businesslike but not unfriendly. Good morning, Elena. I hope you slept well. Coffee, please. Elena accepted a cup of the strongest coffee she had ever tasted and took a seat across from Rebecca. You're up early. Ranch life begins before sunrise, Rebecca explained. There are 47 people employed on this property, plus their families, coordinating their activities, ensuring they have what they need to do their jobs, and managing the household that supports all of them requires careful organization. Elena looked at the papers spread across the table, recognizing some of the organizational challenges from her experience managing her father's affairs, though on a much smaller scale. How do you keep track of everything? Detailed records, careful scheduling, and regular communication with department supervisors, Rebecca replied. She pulled out a thick ledger. This contains employment records for every person who works here, their skills, their families, their housing arrangements, and their wages. This one tracks supply orders, delivery schedules, and inventory levels for everything from food to building materials. Elena studied the meticulous records, impressed by their thoroughness. The level of detail is remarkable. You must have an exceptional memory for all of this. Experience helps, but good record keeping is essential. Would you like to learn how the system works? Very much. Rebecca spent the next 2 hours walking Elena through the complex operations of the ranch household. Elena learned about the seasonal rhythms that determined everything from food preservation to staff scheduling, the delicate balance required to manage relationships with suppliers hundreds of miles away, and the constant coordination needed to ensure that every aspect of ranch life functioned smoothly. The hardest part, Rebecca explained as they toured the ranch's extensive kitchen facilities, is anticipating problems before they become emergencies. If we run short of flour in January, the nearest supplier is a 4-day ride through potentially dangerous weather. If someone gets seriously injured during roundup season, we need medical supplies on hand because the doctor is too far away to help immediately. Eleanor absorbed every detail, asking questions that demonstrated her understanding of the underlying principles. Her experience managing her family's deteriorating situation had taught her to think ahead, to plan for contingencies, and to make difficult decisions with limited resources. Skills that translated well to ranch management, even on this vastly larger scale. After lunch, Rebecca took Elena to visit the school building, a neat structure that housed about 20 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. The current teacher, Mrs. Anderson, was a middle-aged woman who had been hired after Nathaniel's mother's death to continue the educational programs. Mrs. Blackwood was very involved in the children's education, Mrs. Anderson explained to Eleanor. She believed that every child deserved to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic science, regardless of their parents' occupation. She also taught the older girls needlework and household management. Elena watched the children at their lessons, remembering her mother's stories about teaching school in Ohio. What subjects do you find most challenging to teach? Mathematics, primarily because I lack confidence in the subject myself, and some of the older children could benefit from more advanced instruction, but I'm not qualified to provide it. Elena had always been strong with numbers, a skill that had served her well managing her father's accounts. I might be able to help with mathematics instruction if that would be useful. Mrs. Anderson's face brightened. That would be wonderful. These children are bright and eager to learn, but they need teachers who can challenge them appropriately. That evening, Eleanor joined Nathaniel for a quiet dinner in the family's informal dining room. Rebecca had excused herself to handle correspondence, leaving them alone for the first time since their arrival at the ranch. "How was your first day?" Nathaniel asked as they were served a simple but delicious meal. "Educational," Elena replied. "Your sister is remarkable. The level of organization and attention to detail required to manage all of this is extraordinary." "Rebecca has been carrying a heavy burden since Mother died," Nathaniel said. "She's done an exceptional job, but it's more responsibility than any one person should have to handle alone." Elena heard the implication in his words. "Are you hoping I might be able to help with some of those responsibilities?" "Only if it's work you find interesting and meaningful. Rebecca could certainly use assistance, and you have skills that would be valuable. But I don't want you to feel obligated to take on duties you don't enjoy." Eleanor thought about her day. The complex logistics, the careful planning, the satisfaction of seeing well-organized systems functioning smoothly. "Actually, I think I would enjoy it very much. It's similar to what I was doing for my father, but on a scale that makes it genuinely challenging and important." "And the teaching? Mrs. Anderson mentioned you offered to help with mathematics instruction. I'd like to try, if Mrs. Anderson thinks I can be useful. My mother always said teaching was the most rewarding work she'd ever done." Nathaniel smiled, and Elena realized it was the first completely relaxed smile she had seen from him. Mother would be pleased to know someone was continuing her work with the children. As they finished dinner, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable changes in her circumstances. A week ago, she had been facing auction as property to be sold. Now she was discovering that she might have found not just safety and security, but meaningful work and the possibility of genuine partnership. "Nathaniel," she said as they prepared to leave the dining room, "I want to thank you again for what you've done for me, but I also want you to know that I intend to earn my place here. I don't want to be just a rescued damsel who contributes nothing to the family that saved her." "Elena," Nathaniel replied, his voice warm with respect, "in the past 2 days, you've already proven that you're far more than that. You're going to be an asset to this ranch and this family." As Elena prepared for bed that night, she realized that for the first time since her mother's death, she was looking forward to tomorrow. She had work to do, skills to develop, and a place where she might truly belong. The frightened girl from Silver Creek was disappearing, replaced by a woman who was beginning to understand her own strength and potential. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in late October, when Elena had been at the Blackwood Ranch for just over 2 months. She was in the school building, working with the older children on advanced mathematics, when young Tommy Morrison burst through the door with panic written across his face. "Mrs. Blackwood," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Miss Rebecca sent me to fetch you. There's been an accident at the North Pasture, and they need all the help they can get." Elena's heart lurched as she immediately thought of Nathaniel, who had ridden out before dawn to check on the cattle in that area. "What kind of accident, Tommy?" "Stampede, ma'am. Lightning spooked the herd during the night, and they broke through the fence. Some of the hands got caught up in it, and there's injured men and scattered cattle everywhere." Elena turned to Mrs. Anderson, who had gone pale at the news. "Can you manage the children alone for the rest of the day?" "Of course, dear. Go quickly." Elena ran back to the main house, her mind racing through everything she had learned about ranch emergencies during her weeks of education. Rebecca met her at the front door, already dressed in riding attire and carrying a medical bag. "Nathaniel is safe," Rebecca said immediately, seeing Elena's expression. "He sent word ahead, but we have at least 4 injured men, 1 seriously, and about 300 head of cattle scattered across 20 square miles. We need every available person to help with the roundup, and I need someone I trust to oversee the medical care and coordinate supplies." Elena felt a surge of determination, mixed with fear. This was her first real test as a member of the Blackwood family, not a social challenge or a question of domestic skills, but a genuine emergency where people's lives and livelihoods hung in the balance. "What do you need me to do?" "Take charge of the medical situation," Rebecca said, handing Eleanor the heavy bag. "Dr. Mitchell is riding in from town, but he won't arrive for several hours. You'll need to assess the injuries, provide what care you can, and keep the men stable until proper help arrives." Elena had never treated serious injuries before, but she had read some of the medical texts in the ranch's library and had assisted Dr. Jenkins with minor treatments during her brief time in Silver Creek. More importantly, she had learned not to panic in crisis situations. "I'll do my best," she said, taking the medical bag. "What about the cattle roundup?" "I'll coordinate that with the ranch foreman. We need to get those animals back before they wander into the high country where winter storms could kill them." Rebecca paused, studying Elena's face. "Are you sure you can handle the medical responsibilities? Some of these injuries may be quite serious." Elena thought of all the challenges she had already overcome, all the times she had been forced to be stronger than she thought possible. "I can handle it." The ride to the North Pasture took nearly an hour, and Elena used the time to mentally review everything she knew about treating injuries. The medical bag contained supplies for cleaning wounds, setting broken bones, and dealing with various emergencies, along with detailed instructions written in what she recognized as Nathaniel's mother's careful handwriting. When they arrived at the scene, Elena was struck by the scope of the disaster. The fence that had contained the cattle was completely destroyed, with broken posts and twisted wire scattered across a wide area. In the distance, she could see ranch hands on horseback, working to gather the scattered animals. But her immediate attention was drawn to the makeshift shelter where the injured men had been brought. Nathaniel was there, his shirt torn and dirty, but apparently unharmed, coordinating the rescue efforts. When he saw Elena, his face showed both relief and concern. "Thank God you're here," he said, pulling her aside. "We have one man with what looks like a broken leg, another with possible internal injuries from being trampled, and two others with various cuts and bruises. I've done what I can, but they need proper medical attention." Elena opened the medical bag and surveyed its contents, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Show me the most serious cases first." The man with possible internal injuries was Pete Ramirez, an experienced ranch hand who had been with the Blackwood family for over 10 years. He was conscious but in obvious pain, his breathing shallow and his skin pale. Elena knelt beside him, remembering the diagnostic techniques she had read about in the medical texts. "Pete, can you tell me where it hurts most?" "My ribs, Mom," he gasped. "Feels like something's broke inside." Elena carefully examined his torso, feeling for obvious breaks or deformities. She found what appeared to be several cracked ribs, but no sign of the kind of damage that would indicate punctured organs. His pulse was steady, and while he was in pain, he didn't show signs of internal bleeding. "I think you have some broken ribs, but nothing that should be life-threatening," she told him. "We need to keep you still and comfortable until Dr. Mitchell arrives." She moved on to the man with the broken leg, Sam Hutchins, a younger hand who had been thrown from his horse during the initial panic. The break was obvious and severe, with the bone protruding through the skin in what Eleanor recognized as a compound fracture. This was beyond her capabilities, and she knew it, but she also knew that improper treatment could result in permanent disability or even death. Eleanor took a deep breath and opened the medical instruction manual to the section on bone fractures. "Sam, this is going to hurt, but I need to clean this wound and immobilize your leg before infection sets in," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. Working carefully and methodically, Eleanor cleaned the wound site, applied antiseptic, and began the delicate process of aligning the broken bone. Sam gritted his teeth and held Nathaniel's hand while Elena worked, following the manual's instructions as precisely as possible. It took nearly an hour to properly splint the leg, during which time Elena became increasingly aware that every decision she made could have lasting consequences for this young man's future. When she finally finished, Sam's color was better and he seemed more comfortable. "You did good, Mrs. Blackwood," he said weakly. "Feels a lot better now." Eleanor moved on to treat the two men with less serious injuries, cleaning cuts, bandaging wounds, and checking for signs of concussion or other complications. By the time Dr. Mitchell arrived in the late afternoon, she had stabilized all 4 patients and had them resting as comfortably as possible under the circumstances. Dr. Mitchell, a gruff but competent physician who had been practicing frontier medicine for 20 years, examined each of Elena's patients carefully. When he finished, he pulled her aside with an expression of surprised approval. "Where did you learn to treat injuries like this?" he asked. "From books, mostly," Elena admitted, "and from observing other doctors when I had the chance." "Well, you did an excellent job. That compound fracture was set properly, which probably saved that young man from losing his leg. The internal injury assessment was accurate, and your wound care was thorough and professional." He paused, studying her face. "Have you ever considered studying medicine formally?" Elena felt a flutter of excitement at the suggestion. "Is that even possible for a woman in this territory?" "It's uncommon, but not impossible. There's a medical college in Denver that accepts qualified female students. With some additional preparation and the right recommendations, you might be eligible." The conversation was interrupted by the return of the roundup crews, exhausted but successful in their efforts to gather the scattered cattle. Elena learned that the day's crisis had been even more complex than she had initially understood. "We found evidence of deliberate fence cutting," Nathaniel told her, as they prepared to return to the main house. "This wasn't just a lightning-spooked stampede. Someone wanted our cattle scattered and our men injured." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening air. Who would do such a thing? "We're not sure yet, but there have been rumors about outside interests trying to force small ranchers to sell their land to large mining companies. The Blackwood Ranch controls water rights that several mining operations would need for their planned expansions." The implications were disturbing. Elena realized that the family that had rescued her might now be facing threats from people who viewed their success as an obstacle to their own plans. Over the next several days, the ranch operated in a state of heightened alert. Additional guards were posted around the property. Valuable livestock were moved to more secure pastures, and the family implemented new security measures to protect both their assets and their people. Elena found herself taking on an increasingly central role in these preparations. Her experience managing crisis situations proved valuable in coordinating supplies, communication, and medical preparedness. Rebecca, who had initially seen Elena as a potentially useful assistant, began treating her as a genuine partner in ranch management. "You handled yourself remarkably well during the emergency," Rebecca told Eleanor as they reviewed security arrangements in the ranch office. "I've seen grown men panic in less stressful situations." "I learned early that panic doesn't solve problems," Elena replied. "When my father was struggling, I had to become the one who stayed calm and figured out what needed to be done." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "That's a valuable skill, and one that this family needs right now." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor, Daniel Blackwood, Nathaniel's younger brother and federal judge, who had ridden up from Denver with news about the investigation into the ranch's recent troubles. Elena had been nervous about meeting Daniel, wondering if Nathaniel's brother would be as accepting as Rebecca had eventually become. But Daniel greeted her warmly, with the easy confidence of a man secure in his own position and untroubled by social conventions. "So you're the famous Elena," he said with a broad smile. "Nathaniel's letters have been full of praise for your contributions to the ranch. Rebecca tells me you probably saved Sam Hutchins' leg with your medical work." "I just followed the instructions in the medical manual," Elena said modestly. "Don't underestimate what you accomplished," Daniel replied seriously. "Frontier medicine often comes down to keeping people alive until proper help arrives. You did that, and you did it well." Daniel's news about the investigation was both encouraging and concerning. The territorial authorities had identified several mining companies that were systematically targeting successful ranches and farms, using intimidation, sabotage, and legal manipulation to force property owners to sell at below-market prices. "The good news is that we now know who we're dealing with," Daniel explained. "The bad news is that these people have significant financial resources and aren't above using violence to achieve their goals." Elena listened to the discussion of legal strategies and security measures, but her mind was also processing the broader implications of the situation. The Blackwood family's wealth and success had made them targets, and her association with them had made her a potential target as well. "What does this mean for the ranch's operations?" she asked. "Will you need to modify normal activities to account for the threats?" "We'll need to be more careful," Nathaniel replied. "Extra security for valuable livestock, restricted access to certain areas of the property, and better communication systems in case of emergencies." "It also means," Rebecca added, "that we need people we can trust completely in positions of Responsibility. People who can handle crisis situations and make good decisions under pressure. Elena understood that this was both a compliment and a test. The family was acknowledging her capabilities, while also indicating that they expected her to shoulder even greater responsibilities in the difficult times ahead. That evening, as Elena prepared for bed, she reflected on how much her life had changed since arriving at the ranch. She had come as a rescued victim, grateful for safety and basic security. But the events of the past few days had shown her that she was becoming something much more significant, a trusted partner in a family enterprise that was both larger and more complex than she had initially realized. The thought was both exciting and intimidating. Elena had never aspired to be part of anything as important as the Blackwood Ranch operations. But she was discovering that she had capabilities she had never known she possessed, and that the family was depending on her to use those capabilities when they were needed most. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mary Sullivan entered with hot tea and a message from Nathaniel. "Mr. Nathaniel asked me to tell you that there's a family meeting tomorrow morning to discuss long-term plans for dealing with the current situation," Mary said. "He wants you to be there." Eleanor felt a surge of pride at being included in such discussions. Did he say anything else? Just that he's grateful to have someone he trusts helping to handle these challenges, Mary replied with a smile. And Mrs. Rebecca mentioned that she's never seen Mr. Nathaniel look as happy as he has since you arrived. After Mary left, Elena sat by her window, looking out over the ranch that had become her home. In the distance, she could see the lights of the guard posts that now protected the property, reminders that their peaceful life was under threat from people who saw the Blackwood success as something to be destroyed or stolen. But Elena also saw the lights in the workers' houses, the smoke rising from chimneys, and the evidence of a thriving community that provided livelihoods for dozens of families. This was worth protecting, and she was determined to do whatever she could to help ensure its survival. The frightened girl who had stood on the auction block in Silver Creek seemed like a memory from someone else's life. In her place was a woman who had found not just security and comfort, but purpose and partnership in work that mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Elena was no longer afraid of challenges. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, and that strength was exactly what her new family needed from her. The trials by fire had proven her worth, both to herself and to the people who had come to depend on her. Now, it was time to see what they could accomplish together. The winter of 1884 brought challenges that tested everything Elena had learned about strength, courage, and the true meaning of family. Snow fell early and heavily that year, isolating the Blackwood Ranch for weeks at a time and creating perfect conditions for the enemies who sought to destroy everything the family had built. Elena stood at the window of the ranch office on a bitter February morning, watching the latest blizzard pile snow against the buildings and wondering how much longer their supplies would last. The mining company consortium had escalated their campaign of intimidation throughout the winter, cutting off supply routes, bribing government officials, and spreading rumors designed to destroy the Blackwood family's business relationships. "The Denver Bank is demanding immediate payment on the spring loan," Nathaniel said from behind her, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They claim our credit rating has been compromised by questions about ranch management and security." Elena turned from the window to study the man who had become so much more than her rescuer over the past months. Nathaniel looked older than his 32 years, worn down by the constant pressure of fighting enemies who attacked from shadows while presenting respectable faces to the world. "How much time do we have?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. At the desk, covered with legal documents and financial statements. 6 weeks, Nathaniel replied, If we can't raise $50,000 by the 1st of April, they can foreclose on the entire ranch. Elena felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, but also something else, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. The Blackwood Ranch had become more than her home. It was her calling, her purpose, and the foundation of her new identity. She would not stand by and watch it be destroyed by men who saw other people's dreams as obstacles to their own greed. "What about the cattle sales?" she asked, reviewing the financial projections they had worked on together. "The spring roundup should generate substantial revenue if we can get the cattle to market," Nathaniel said grimly. "The consortium has been pressuring the railroad to refuse our shipping contracts. They claim our livestock might carry disease, though every veterinary inspection has shown our herds to be perfectly healthy." Elena studied the maps spread across the desk, showing the various routes from the ranch to potential markets. An idea began to form in her mind, dangerous, unprecedented, but potentially their only hope. "What about the Chicago buyers?" she asked. "The ones who've been asking for direct contracts without going through the Denver middlemen." Nathaniel looked up from his papers with surprised interest. "Thomas Morrison and his partners. They're offering top dollar, but they want delivery. Guarantees we can't make with the railroad situation uncertain. What if we drove the cattle to market ourselves?" Eleanor said quietly. 1,000 head overland to the railroad terminus in Nebraska. It would take 3 weeks, but it would bypass all the local interference. The silence that followed her suggestion was so complete that Elena could hear the wind howling around the buildings outside. She watched Nathaniel's face as he processed the implications of what she had proposed. "Elena," he said finally, "cattle, drives of that scale, haven't been attempted in this territory for over a decade. The risks are enormous. Weather, predators, rustlers, river crossings. We could lose everything." "We're going to lose everything anyway if we don't try something desperate," Elena replied. "At least this way, we're taking action instead of waiting for our enemies to destroy us piecemeal." Rebecca entered the office at that moment, stamping snow from her boots and carrying reports from the various ranch foremen. She immediately noticed the tension in the room. "What are you two plotting?" she asked, hanging up her coat and moving to warm her hands by the fireplace. "Elena is suggesting we organize a cattle drive to Nebraska," Nathaniel said, his tone suggesting he was still evaluating the feasibility of the idea. Rebecca's eyebrows rose sharply. "That's either brilliant or completely insane, possibly both. It might be our only option," Elena said, spreading out the territorial maps. "Look at the routes. If we can get past the mountain passes before the spring thaws make them impassable, we could reach the Nebraska railhead in time to complete the Chicago contracts." Rebecca studied the maps carefully, her expression growing more thoughtful. "The logistics would be incredibly complex. We'd need experienced trail hands, supply wagons, advanced scouts, and contingency plans for every possible disaster." "But it could work," Nathaniel said, warming to the idea despite its risks. "Morrison's people are offering $37 per head, delivered to railside. 1,000 head would gross $37,000, enough to satisfy the bank. Loan with money left over for ranch improvements." Elena felt excitement building as the plan took shape. "We have experienced hands, and Daniel mentioned that several other ranchers are facing similar pressure from the consortium. What if we organized a cooperative drive? Multiple herds, shared costs and risks, and enough people to handle any trouble we encounter." The next several hours were spent in intense planning sessions, with maps spread across every available surface and the ranch's senior staff called in to evaluate different aspects of the proposed venture. By evening, what had started as Elena's desperate suggestion had evolved into a comprehensive plan, involving 4 different ranches and nearly 3,000 head of cattle. "It's ambitious enough to work," declared Marcus Webb, the ranch foreman who had been with the Blackwood family for 15 years. The consortium won't expect us to try something this big and risky. They'll be watching the usual shipping routes while we're driving cattle across open country. Elena found herself at the center of the planning process, her organizational skills and attention to detail proving invaluable in coordinating the complex logistics. She worked closely with Rebecca to arrange supply lines, with Nathaniel to negotiate agreements with the other participating ranchers, and with the various foremen to select personnel and equipment. "You realize," Rebecca said during one late-night planning session, "that you'll need to accompany the drive. Your knowledge of the financial arrangements and supply coordination makes you indispensable to the operation." Elena felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with fear. She had never been more than a day's ride from the ranch since arriving in Wyoming, and the proposed journey would take her hundreds of miles from everything familiar. But she also recognized that this was her opportunity to contribute something truly significant to the family that had given her everything. "I'll need to learn to handle cattle work," she said practically, "and I'll need clothes and equipment suitable for 3 weeks on the trail." Mother did a cattle drive with Father when they were first married, Rebecca said thoughtfully. "Her trail clothes are still in storage, along with her saddle and gear. You're about the same size she was." The weeks of preparation that followed were among the most intense of Elena's life. She learned to ride cutting horses, to work with lasso and branding iron, and to handle the hundreds of details involved in moving large numbers of livestock across challenging terrain. She also discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the work, perhaps inherited from generations of farm families who had learned to work with animals and land. More importantly, she found herself working alongside Nathaniel in ways that brought them closer together than their formal marriage arrangement had ever accomplished. The shared challenge of organizing the cattle drive created a partnership based on mutual respect, complementary skills, and growing personal affection. "You know," Nathaniel said one evening as they reviewed supply lists by lamplight, "I never expected our marriage to develop this way." Elena looked up from her calculations, studying his face in the warm light. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I thought I was simply preventing a tragedy from happening to someone who didn't deserve it. I never imagined that you would become—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "What?" Elena prompted gently. "My partner. My equal. Someone I could depend on completely and trust with everything that matters to me." Elena felt her heart skip at the admission. "Is that what I've become?" "More than that," Nathaniel said quietly. "You've become the person I didn't know I was looking for." "Elena, what I'm trying to say is that somewhere between rescuing you and working alongside you, I fell in love with you. Not with the idea of being your protector, but with you. Your strength, your intelligence, your determination to build something meaningful from the chances you've been given." Elena set down her pen and looked at this man who had transformed her life in ways she was still discovering. "Nathaniel, I need you to know that the gratitude I felt when you saved me from that auction block has grown into something much deeper. You didn't just rescue me from a terrible situation. You gave me the space and support to become the person I was meant to be. And that person loves you completely." The kiss that followed was their first as equals, rather than rescuer and rescued, and it carried the promise of a future built on genuine partnership rather than obligation or convenience. The cattle drive began on a clear March morning with nearly 40 riders, 3,000 head of cattle, and supply wagons carrying everything needed for 3 weeks on the trail. Elena rode alongside Nathaniel at the head of the procession, wearing her mother-in-law's trail clothes and carrying the responsibilities of expedition coordinator. The first week of the drive tested every aspect of their planning. They encountered spring storms that scattered cattle across miles of prairie, river crossings that required careful coordination to prevent losses, and the constant challenge of maintaining discipline among both animals and humans under difficult conditions. Elena discovered that trail life suited her in ways she hadn't expected. The physical demands were substantial, but the sense of purpose and accomplishment was deeply satisfying. She found herself respected by the ranch hands, not because she was the boss's wife, but because she proved herself capable of doing whatever work the situation required. Mrs. Blackwood handles herself like she was born to this life, she overheard one of the experienced hands tell another. Never complains, never asks for special treatment, and knows what needs doing without being told. The real test came during the second week, when they encountered the opposition Elena had been expecting. A group of armed men intercepted the drive near the Colorado-Nebraska border, claiming authority to inspect the cattle for disease and demanding documentation that would have delayed the expedition by weeks. Elena recognized the tactic immediately. Legal harassment designed to prevent them from reaching the market in time to complete their contracts. But she had prepared for this possibility. "Gentlemen," she said, riding forward to confront the leader of the group, "I have documentation from territorial veterinary authorities confirming the health of these animals. Federal interstate commerce permits authorizing this drive, and letters of credit from Chicago buyers guaranteeing payment upon delivery." Growing frustration, clearly looking for grounds to stop the drive, but finding everything apparently in order. "Furthermore," Elena continued, her voice carrying the authority she had learned from watching Rebecca manage ranch business, "any interference with this legitimate commercial activity will be reported to federal authorities as an unlawful restraint of interstate trade." The standoff continued for several tense hours, with armed men on both sides prepared for violence if negotiations failed. But Elena's combination of legal documentation and confident authority eventually convinced the opposition that stopping the drive would create more problems than it solved. "You can proceed," the leader finally announced, "but be aware that your activities are being monitored by interested parties." Elena nodded politely. "We appreciate your diligence in protecting territorial interests. Good day, gentlemen." After the opposition rode away, Nathaniel joined Elena at the head of the column, his expression mixing admiration with amazement. "Where did you learn to handle a situation like that?" "From watching you and Rebecca deal with difficult people," Elena replied, "and from understanding that bullies usually back down when faced with someone who refuses to be intimidated." The final week of the drive brought them across the Nebraska border and toward the railroad terminus, where Chicago buyers waited with cash payments for delivered cattle. Elena felt growing excitement as they approached their destination, knowing that success would mean not just financial survival for the ranch, but validation of her own transformation from auction block victim to full partner in the Blackwood family enterprise. The cattle sale exceeded even their most optimistic projections. The Chicago buyers, impressed by the quality of the livestock and the professionalism of the operation, offered premium prices and discussed long-term contracts that would provide steady income for years to come. $42 per head, Thomas Morrison announced as he completed his inspection of the delivered cattle. "That's the highest price I've paid for Wyoming beef, but the quality justifies it completely." Elena calculated quickly, nearly $126,000 for 3,000 head, more than double what they needed to satisfy the bank loan, and enough to fund significant expansion of ranch operations. But the financial success, significant as it was, paled beside the personal triumph Elena felt as she stood with Nathaniel, watching the last of the cattle being loaded onto railroad cars. She had traveled from the depths of desperation to partnership in one of the most successful ranches in Wyoming territory, and she had earned that position through her own capabilities rather than simply accepting it as charity. "We did it," Nathaniel said, taking her hand as they watched the train prepare to depart. "We saved the ranch, defeated the consortium's plans, and proved that we can handle whatever challenges come our way." "We did it together," Elena corrected. "All of us. Your family, the ranch hands, the other participating ranchers. That's what made it possible. The journey back to Wyoming took only 3 days by passenger train, a stark contrast to the 3 weeks they had spent on the trail. Elena spent the time writing detailed reports of the expedition's successes and lessons learned, already planning improvements for future drives. But she also spent time reflecting on the extraordinary changes in her life over the past year. The frightened girl who had been sold at auction to pay gambling debts seemed like a character from someone else's story. In her place was a woman who had proven herself capable of managing complex business operations, handling dangerous situations, and contributing meaningfully to work that mattered. The homecoming celebration at the Blackwood Ranch lasted 3 days, with workers and neighbors gathering to congratulate the successful expedition and share in the financial security it had provided. Elena found herself at the center of the festivities, recognized not as an outsider who had been accepted into the family, but as a full member whose contributions were essential to the family's success. "I have an announcement," Nathaniel declared, during the celebration dinner, rising from his chair with a formal expression that made Eleanor's heart skip. "Elena and I were married under emergency circumstances that didn't allow for proper celebration or recognition of what our union truly means." Elena felt her cheeks flush as she realized what was coming. "I would like to invite everyone to join us next month for a proper wedding ceremony," Nathaniel continued, "where we can celebrate not just our legal marriage, but our partnership in love, work, and life." The announcement was greeted with enthusiastic applause and congratulations, but Eleanor barely heard them. She was looking at Nathaniel, seeing in his expression the complete love and respect that had grown between them over months of shared challenges and discoveries. "Is that a proposal?" she asked quietly, for his ears alone. "It's a recognition of what we've already built together," he replied, "and a promise of what we'll create in the future." The wedding ceremony took place on a perfect May morning in 1884, exactly 1 year after Elena's rescue from the auction block in Silver Creek. This time, instead of a desperate legal transaction conducted in a judge's chambers, Elena walked down the aisle of the ranch's chapel wearing her mother-in-law's wedding dress, surrounded by friends and family who had come to celebrate a love story that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. Rebecca served as matron of honor. Daniel performed the ceremony in his capacity as a federal judge, and Elena's father, sober now for 6 months and working as a carpenter in Denver, walked her down the aisle with tears of pride and redemption in his eyes. "Do you, Elena Hayes Blackwood, take this man to be your husband in love, in partnership, and in the shared work of building a life together?" Elena looked at Nathaniel, thinking of everything they had overcome and everything they had built together. "I do." "Do you, Nathaniel Blackwood, take this woman to be your wife in love, in partnership, and in the shared work of building a life together?" "I do," Nathaniel replied, his voice strong with conviction. "Then by the authority vested in me by Wyoming Territory and the United States government, I pronounce you husband and wife, partners in all things, and architects of your own destiny." The kiss that sealed their vows was witnessed by 300 people, but Elena felt as if she and Nathaniel were alone in the world, surrounded by the love they had discovered and the future they would create together. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Elena and Nathaniel stood together on the ranch house veranda, looking out over the land that had become their shared domain and their shared responsibility. "Any regrets?" Nathaniel asked, his arm around her waist. Elena thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the fear and desperation of her father's gambling debts, the humiliation of standing on an auction block, the terror of being sold to strangers who might have destroyed her. And then she thought of everything that had followed, the gradual building of trust and respect, the discovery of capabilities she had never known she possessed, the growth of love that was based on equality rather than obligation. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Everything that happened, even the terrible parts, led us to where we are now. And where we are now is exactly where I want to be. Even though it started with you being sold like property," Elena smiled, thinking of how completely her circumstances had changed. "Especially because it started that way. It means I'll never take any of this for granted. Not our love, not our partnership, not the opportunity to build something meaningful together." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Wyoming prairie and thinking about the future that stretched before them. There would be challenges ahead. There always were in ranch life, but they would face them together as equals, as partners, and as two people who had learned that love could grow from the most unlikely soil. "Mrs. Blackwood," Nathaniel said, using her title with the same respect he had shown from their first meeting, "what would you like to do tomorrow?" Elena considered the question, thinking of all the projects they had planned, all the improvements they wanted to make to the ranch, all the ways they could expand their operations and their impact on the community around them. "I'd like to work alongside my husband," she said simply, "building something that will last long after we're gone. And after that? After that, I'd like to teach our children that anything is possible when people treat each other with respect, work hard for what they believe in, and never give up on love." Nathaniel pulled her closer, and Eleanor felt the absolute security of knowing she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the kind of life she had always dreamed of, but never dared hope she could achieve. In the distance, lights began to appear in the windows of the workers. Houses, smoke rose from chimneys, and the sounds of a thriving community drifted across the evening air. The Blackwood Ranch had become more than a successful business. It was home to dozens of families, a center of education and progress, and a testament to what could be accomplished when people worked together toward common goals. Elena had traveled from being property to be sold, to being a partner in building something that would benefit generations to come. It was a journey that had required every ounce of strength, courage, and determination she possessed, but it had led her to a life beyond anything she could have imagined. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elena made a silent promise. To the girl she had been, standing terrified on that auction block in Silver Creek, your suffering was not in vain. Your strength brought you to love, to purpose, and to a future worth every struggle it took to reach it. The young bride who had been auctioned to pay her father's gambling debts had become the architect of her own destiny, and her story would inspire others for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.